I've been working on the idea of the commons for the past number of years with a number of colleagues, and trying to imagine what a commons approach to water would actually translate to in terms of institutional arrangements in Ireland. But I want to start with the debate about public and private water. You'll remember that over the past number of years, water has proven to be one of the most politically contentious issues in Ireland, and became the focus point of anti-austerity resistance. And in that resistance, we saw assertions like these, hands off public water, so asserting the public nature of water, but also a fear that the specific measure of introducing water charges constituted a move towards the privatisation of water. So this was so these notions of public and private were central to the controversy, and where much of the political mobilisation was seen and represented as being an attempt to retain water in public ownership and resist any sort of privatisation of it. Now, as part of that struggle, there were calls for a constitutional referendum. So these are just three examples, one from the Green Party, another from Impact, and another from the umbrella organisation Right to Water, but where all of these were calling for a constitutional referendum to ensure that water, both water itself and water services, would remain as public property and public entities. It's hard to believe, I think, when I was putting this together earlier, it's hard to believe that this is this report from the Joint Oireachtas Committee on the Future Funding of Domestic Water Charges came out less than a year ago. So less than a year ago, this debate was still very, very much to the fore, but it has since pretty much evaporated from the public agenda, or from certainly the political contention around it has abated. But just staying with these calls for a constitutional referendum, in November 2016, the Expert Commission on Domestic Public Water Services had as its very first recommendation that there would be a constitutional referendum on water. And then subsequently, in April of last year, the Joint Oireachtas Committee also had as its very first recommendation recommendations around the public ownership of water. So you can see that they say the Joint Committee on the Future Funding of Domestic Water Services supports the concept of a referendum on the issue of water services continuing in public ownership, and believes that public ownership should be enshrined in the Constitution as an extra measure of protection against any privatisation. So this was a proposal that was regarded as really significant and as playing an important part in resolving what was regarded as the crisis around the political crisis around water. But what we see is within a matter of by October of 2017, the Taoiseach Leo Varadkar was saying really a referendum on water wasn't really necessary, and where he said that any chance of water being privatised was both impossible and absurd, and went on to list a number of other issues that he felt should be given priority in terms of the queue of issues to be dealt with through the Constitution. But this is, I think, an interesting, it could make an interesting political study in itself around how well, when is a controversy no longer a controversy? But as far as Leo Varadkar was concerned, this was no longer an issue, even though we had this Oireachtas committee making it as its primary recommendation. In the context of that discussion, I think it's important for us to think critically about this term privatisation and what constitutes privatisation. Because I think there's considerable evidence that ever before the most recent economic crisis, processes of privatisation of our public water supplies were well and truly underway. Just returning to that wording in the constitutional referendum about retaining the public water services and public ownership, I think it's very questionable to what extent they are in public ownership. And there's been quite a lot of very interesting work done on this. So one person who's been working on this is Owen Reeves in UL, and he has been charting the privatisation of public water services, the infrastructure and the delivery of public water services through the mechanism of PPPs, of public-private partnerships. And this is just from his article in the Economic and Social Review, where he shows that in May 2009, if we look at the PPP projects throughout Ireland, the vast majority of them are in water and wastewater services. So we could say that, well, for me, this is evidence of how the privatisation of public water services and infrastructure is already at an advanced stage in this country. In his work, he talks about like comparing the use of public-private partnerships in Ireland with other countries, and the use of the PPP in water services was, I think Ireland had the second highest rate of PPP water services in all of Europe. So this is something as a policy measure that has been very much embraced in Ireland. Another way where we can look at, well, what does this term privatisation actually mean? A colleague of mine, Fiona Duclos, has written a chapter in a book that she co-edited on the welfare state in 21st century Ireland. And she, in that discussion, she looks at the recently established national water utility, Irish Water, and looks at how really, even though it is the national utility, that it is set up very much to be, well, because of this orientation or this requirement that it be self-funding, which of course it can't be now, given the abolition of the water charges, or that original proposal for the funding of Irish Water has been scuppered. But that she argues that in essence it was established in law to act as a private company. So the way in which utilities like this are set up can involve processes of privatisation too. Also, and I think very significant in this is the role of, well, the transformation of citizens into customers. So we see, again, with the legislation, but also we see this in Irish Water's own discourses, water users or citizens are constructed as customers. So we see a shift in what water is, but also how we are positioned in our relationship with water. We see this. I was a member of the Public Water Forum, which was established really, I think, to try and well, it was. I think it was kind of hangover from the idea of public partnership, that if we bring various people together with differing views, some sort of consensus can be reached. That wasn't the case. And the Public Water Forum has since been incorporated into a national water forum. But even where we see the word public being used in the title of that forum, it's still, we still see water users constructed as customers. So we're not so much there as members of the public or citizens, but as customers of Irish water. So there's been a lot of really good work being done in Ireland around processes of neoliberalisation. So rather than seeing talking about neoliberalism as a thing, there has been an emphasis on the processes through which it occurs. And this is what sensitises us, I think, or helps us see that privatisation, well, that can take many forms, but also that it can be associated with a number of other processes. So some of the processes, some of the many processes of neoliberalisation that have been identified include privatisation, marketisation, deregulation, re-regulation, corporatisation, financialisation. But one of these processes is the process of commercialisation. And this was one of the concerns people had about the introduction of water charges, that it wasn't seen as privatising, it wasn't seen as an act of privatisation, but it was seen as a step where you commercialise, where water becomes a billable commodity that customers receive from Irish water. And that was seen as a step, well, a process that can then precede the process of privatisation. So these were some of the concerns that were some of the concerns that were raised, but also some of the efforts that have been made to encourage us to have a more sophisticated understanding of what privatisation actually entails. That it doesn't necessarily just require, say, the selling off of Irish water to some private corporation, but that actually there could be processes of privatisation and associated processes underway. With the abolition or the decision not to proceed with the water charges, some people involved in the campaign, or what's been called the Irish Water War, celebrated this as a substantial victory for people power. This was the slogan used by the Right to Water campaign. But they did in this. Now they've since revised that position. But even at that time, it was regarded as a significant victory for people power. But the final part of their heading in this slide, I think, was significant, where they said, "But the campaign will go on." But actually, what we have seen is, even though Right to Water is still active, the public mobilisation around water has largely disappeared. There haven't been any of the big protests. Water doesn't dominate the news media in the way it did a year ago, 2 years ago. It's rarely discussed in the Dáil. So really, it seems to be a controversy that has died to a large extent. So the campaign isn't continuing in the way that it was. But I think for many people, me included, not everything is resolved. That the abolition of charges wasn't the only thing. And well, what I hope you can see in what I've been arguing is that it wasn't just about the charges. Okay, charges contributed to this commercialisation of water, but the abolition of those charges, I think, it would be it would be to attach far greater significance to them than I think they deserve, because that doesn't see all of these other processes that were underway. So I'm part of a group that has been that doesn't accept that the controversy is over, that doesn't accept Leo Varadkar's claim that the possibility that privatisation is absurd, but I'm also part of a group that is interested in exploring what it would mean if we understood water as a commons. And this requires a very different understanding. The focus is not so much on the property regimes, not so much on whether state is owned by the state, owned and managed by the state or by private corporations, but thinking about water as a commons can open up a whole other set of questions for us as well. So last June I was involved with, it was in cooperation with a colleague in the geography department in Trinity, Patrick Bresnahan, also a colleague from Galway and Mayo, GMIT, Mark Garvin, who's involved with FASTA, the Foundation for Sustainable Economics, I think, but also with the Community Development Journal. So we organised this thinkery on anti-privatisation struggles in the commons, and we were interested in exploring how anti-privatisation struggles mobilised around water internationally mobilise the idea of the commons, that they use the commons, the idea of the commons in different ways. So we were interested in seeing what do they mean by the commons, and what does the meaning that they employ, what kind of politics, how does that steer their politics. But what we see before just explaining the three different ways in which these struggles articulate the commons that we addressed, I think it's important to note that in Ireland we don't really use the language of the commons that much. It's not very prominent in political discourse. It did appear to some extent in the work of some of the campaigns, some of the Right to Water campaigns, but it's not something. It's not a term that I think that's very prominent in Irish political discourse, and we associate it more, I think, with commonage, with land commonage. So there it's understood as any land that's owned by two or more people. So quite a minimalist understanding of the concept of the commons. It has been promoted by the International Association for the Study of the Commons, and I think which was established partly by Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics. She was the first woman to win the Nobel Prize for Economics, I think in 2007, 2008. But her work, I think, has been significant in gaining attention to the commons. And also, I think that, an essay written by Harden in the 60s, The Tragedy of the Commons, really, I think, articulated a dominant view that any sort of common, that commons are doomed, that individual greed will always undermine the possibility of any sort of communal ownership arrangements. But what Elinor Ostrom and her colleagues did was to highlight a number of functioning commons internationally. So they have, I think this association has been quite significant in popularizing the idea of the commons again, certainly in academic circles. But if you go onto their website, and they have a very short little video clip which you can look at in your own time, but essentially they talk about commons as groups of people, of citizens who collectively own and manage a resource, and they represent it as a governance regime. But this is only one version of the commons. I've been involved in organising a number of thinkeries on the commons. So a few years ago we had the Mexican writer Gustavo Esteva. He's a post-development theorist, and he talks about the commons, the interpretation of the commons and commoning used by the Zapatistas in Mexico, and theirs is very different to this. A year after that we had another event where we had Silvia Federici and George Kafensis, and they talk about the anti-capitalist commons, which was again slightly different from Gustavo Esteva's version. So there are multiple interpretations of the commons. I think this type of the International Association for the Study of the Commons model is criticised by some others as it can operate within a capitalist system, whereas the others see it as, even as I mentioned with George Kafensis and Silvia Federici, they see it very much as an anti-capitalist type of commoning. So there are varying interpretations as to what constitutes the commons, but I think it is fair to say that there is a renewed interest in this concept, and we see all sorts of organisations promoting it, from ranging from the World Bank to anarchist organisations. So it is, I think, fair to say a chaotic concept. There's multiple interpretations of it. Just to give you some sense of the various ways in which it has been interpreted, if you go back to Raymond Williams, the work of the cultural theorist Raymond Williams, his classic work Key Words, when he looks at the word commons, he looks at how it was used, even if we think of the House of Commons, if you think of it as how it's used in the British context, it was used, or even the idea of the commoner, that it was regarded as what is distinct from the nobility. But what we see with the International Association for the Study of the Commons, it is seen as a kind of governance system, a kind of property regime. So this is where common is used to, or the commons is seen as distinct from private property or public property or open access regimes, but it's really a set of institutional property rights, property right arrangements. So Eleanor Ostrom, she used the phrase of common pool resource. So her work, and as I mentioned, her work was concerned with highlighting a number of functioning commons or common pool resources. So much of her work was done on fisheries and forestry. Although they didn't see it, and the International Association for the Study of the Commons recognises that there are many of these new commons, so online activity, cyber commons, knowledge as a commons. But this is very much seen in terms of property. Others see, and certainly Gustavo Esteva, who I mentioned, he rejects the idea of the commons as something that's commonly owned, that it's a property regime. But for him, it refers to things that are integral to life, and never should be subject to property rules. So things that are beyond property, that we should think of as beyond any possibility of ownership, including public ownership. So this is another way of seeing the commons. I like the work of Wagner, who talks about he talks about the commons not so much as a set of institutional arrangements, but for him it's a social imaginary or an ideascape. So he refers to it as an alternative to the neoliberal imaginary that has so dominated the world economic system over the past several decades. So for him, the commons is as much about trying to imagine alternative ways of being in the world as it is to do with institutional arrangements or property regimes. So in much of the I suppose what has now come to be regarded as the classical literature on the commons, it is repeatedly emphasised that the term can be used both as a noun, but crucially it is also a verb, so that a commons isn't a thing, but it's a set of relationships. So it's about commoning. It's about how we relate to each other and other things. So if we're talking about water, it's not about, the emphasis isn't just on seeing water as a commons, but the challenge is to engage in water commoning. And the group that I'm part of this is the activity that we're engaging in, and part of that is about imagining a water commons, imagining what water commoning in Ireland would look like. So I mentioned the Thinkery, the event we had in June, where we invited people who are involved in water anti-privatisation struggles locally and nationally. So people who are involved in the struggles around water here in Ireland, but also we invited people from Catalonia, from Italy, and also from the United States, where somebody who was involved, an activist from the Standing Rock campaign, spoke. And what we explored that day was 3 different ways in which these struggles are articulating the commons, 3 different ways in which they're understanding what the common. How they're interpreting the commons, but also how that is then informing the political struggles in which they're involved. So the first one is what we came to refer to as the constitutional commons. And an illustration of this is the Italian water movement and how it mobilized a popular referendum. This isn't the same kind of referendum. This is a popular referendum, not the kind of constitutional referendum that was being spoken about in the Irish context. They have a different system where certain numbers of people organise. It's a kind of petitioning that they can then call for a constitutional referendum. So in this one, this popular referendum, they found, that the vast majority of people who voted in it voted in favour of constitutional recognition of water as a bene comune, which they translate for us as a commons, but one that should be democratically governed. So the idea of the commons is something that has been used. This notion of the commons has been promoted by the Italian water movement, and it is very much associated with asserting the right to water which was a slogan, that is a feature of many anti-privatisation struggles and was also prominent in the Irish context. The second articulation of the commons is one that we refer to as the remunicipalised commons. And here the water movement in Catalonia serves as a case in point. So this is about, in a way, it's about reinterpreting the public. So it's about returning water to municipal control, but it's not just that. It's also about, so it's public water, but with the difference. So it's seen to be where there's an emphasis on popular participation and control. This process of remunicipalisation is something that has been occurring in many places. So in Paris, so the Paris water supply went from being public to being private to being remunicipalised. We see this in Berlin. So this is something that is occurring in many countries. So it's a move back from privatisation to the public. Although in some instances in Catalonia it was never public; it had always been private. But this is the process of remunicipalisation. So this is a different meaning of the commons to the constitutional one. But the one that I think is the most radical version of the commons of the three we explored was what we're referring to as the more than human commons. And this is informed by or articulates post-humanist and new materialist perspectives. So this is about a move away from what we might call an anthropocentric understanding of the commons. So it goes beyond an understanding of politics as just a human affair and of nature or water as a resource. It articulates that with the commons. And an example here is the Standing Rock indigenous water war. So we see that many indigenous peoples articulate the commons, but in a particular way. So this final version of the commons is it rejects modernist understandings of water as a resource that can be owned and that needs to be managed. And I think we can see that for the most part in the controversy over water in Ireland, this is how water itself was understood. That there was this modernist understanding. Both people who were in favour of the introduction of water charges and people opposed to it. Water was still something to be owned and managed. And in the case of many who were opposed to the water charges, it was to be owned and managed by the state. But this more than human understanding of the commons recognises water itself as a living entity. And it really does bring us into a very different understanding of what it is to be human and of human embodiment. So in this understanding, human embodiment and water are inseparable. And they do move away from this very Western idea of the individual as some kind of autonomous, discrete agent. Now, when Gustavo Esteva was at our Thinkery on the Commons, he explained this understanding, this undoing of the very Western notion of the individual. He explained it in following terms. He said, it's not about me connecting with nature, but seeing that I am nature. And said we can illustrate this by asking if the air we have in our lungs right now, is it yours or is it you? Is it nature or is it you? no, it's the same. We cannot be separated. This idea of separation is an absurd construction. So rather than seeing the idea of the individual and maybe connecting or valuing nature, this is very much an idea that the emphasis is on interconnectedness, the inseparability of the human and the what we call the nature, the natural world. Now, this might seem very. These perspectives might seem to be very. Well, they are very far removed from conventional thinking. Certainly, very far removed from. If we look at the policy discourses surrounding the establishment of Irish Water, but I think there are some very interesting efforts. Well, for many people, Chas Jewett, the woman who was involved in the Standing Rock, well, she was a water, not protester, but a water protector, that she would argue that this is the outlook, this is the understanding of water that informed those protests. During the week, a student, I'm involved in teaching on the Masters in Public Health, and we were looking at the idea of post-humanism, and one of the students presented a discussion on this article, Making Wild Law Work, and it's from a law, it's from the Journal of Environmental Law, but it's where that well, it's about how can we legislate for an ecocentric rather than an anthropocentric understanding. So the more than human commons, which might seem like a very abstract, far removed idea, that we see that actually efforts are being made to imagine what that might look like in legal terms. And also, and these, so I think, so this is, you could say, it is about a search for radically different ways of relating to water, radically different ways of understanding our relationship with water, and radically different institutional arrangements to those that we currently have in the aftermath of the water war, that supposedly is no longer, well, that how the water crisis has been resolved in the Irish context. And just one other slide that I'll lead you with, which challenges there's no alternative, that type of thinking. There's no alternative to the way, the kind of inevitability of the water policy that we have in Ireland. The Transnational Institute, TNI, has this recent initiative called an Atlas of Utopias. But these are, what it identifies are a series of real life projects where people are doing things in radically different ways to, I suppose, the kinds of ways that we are told are inevitable in Irish water policy. And what's interesting about this Atlas of Utopia is that how many of them are focused on water. So some of these involve, versions of some of the commons that I've been talking about. So some of them are instances of this remunicipalization, but also I think many of them could be regarded as instances of commoning. So commoning isn't just some sort of abstract. Well, it does involve a project of imagining. It is a whole developing a new world view, but it isn't all. The commons movement isn't just operating at that level, but there are many real life projects as well, and I think These are certainly worthy of attention and can enrich the debate about water in Ireland and bring it beyond just this debate as to whether it should be publicly owned or privately owned.
Very good.
Okay.
That's fantastic, Orla. Thank you.
So, any questions?
Yeah, this is. I've never heard of this before. This is very good. It's one of the sort of aspects of our work which we're looking to push more in the next coming years. Is this the idea of citizen monitoring of water quality? And I think this is a good way of framing the concept. You know what I mean? Not just water as a commons, but the actual. If you break that down even further, and the water quality, just that one specific aspect of water as a commons, and how everyone can, obviously, has a vested interest in ensuring that that quality is suitable for whatever they want to use it for.
Yes.
So I think that's something I've definitely taken away from this, is that would be a good approach and a good way that we can sell it. You know, if we can use that word, sort of that comments, but you know what I mean. It's a good way of packaging it.
Yeah. Well, I think on the idea of citizenship, like I think it is significant that this discursive shift towards the customer. I think that is significant and very troubling. But I think just in terms of what you've just mentioned, one of the good things that came out of the water controversy, regardless of your position on the charges, is that I think it did promote a kind of water literacy. That you know, water wasn't just this thing that you turn your, you know, that a new awareness of water emerged. Even in terms of the water policy. Even who are the bodies who are responsible for, you know, so I think there was a kind of